Hi, this is George Alger with another segment of Our Ventura. And today I'm speaking with Craig Shields, who is the author of Is Renewable Really Doable? Actually, this is his second book on the subject of renewable energy. And Craig is also the editor of OurVentura.com and is a speaker on all subjects renewable. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks very much, George.
Craig, let's just lay a little groundwork here in terms of renewable energy in general. Where would you say we are as a culture in terms of moving towards incorporating more renewable energy into our power grid?
Yes, exactly right. Well, it depends on what you mean by a civilization or a culture. In other words, if you're talking about the United States, that's one thing. What they're doing in Europe, South America, Asia, and so forth is slightly different. I would say we generally as a culture are beginning to recognize the importance of this, simply because in the last, think of what's happened in the last couple of decades. So oil shortages are number one. That got people's attention when you and I were much younger. We also have, of course, climate issues. We're 97% of the climate scientists who are studying this, and have been since the 70s, about 40 years, are telling us that if we don't do something immediate to reduce the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, we're ruining this planet, and we will soon get to the point where it cannot be fixed. So there are issues associated with all of this. So we're running out of it. It's causing healthcare issues. It's causing environmental issues. Ocean acidification. The oceans absorb some CO2 from the atmosphere, but that changes the chemistry of the oceans, and it's ruining the very delicate ecologic balances that exist in our oceans.
Now, there are some folks, I don't know what percentage of scientists, but there are some ideas out there that these types of things would be caused naturally, or that it's really not, at least it's not fossil fuels that is the driver behind these bad changes. I mean, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I only know what I read. I mean, to be honest with you, you're talking to a guy who has no independent course of action with respect to studying this thing. So I can only go by what I'm told. And you're absolutely right that there are huge fluctuations in terms of natural climate change on this planet over the last 4.5 billion years. There's no question about that. I believed, simply because almost every climate scientist believes it, is that human activity, even the Cato Institute, I was just at the right-wing think tank in Washington, D.C. the other day, even they've changed their kind of position on this thing, and are saying that human activity, industrial activity essentially, post the Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century, is in fact changing the climate. So, I mean, yes, there's some fringe viewpoints that suggest that this is a complete coincidence, or that it's a hoax, or that it's essentially corrupt. In other words, the scientists, there are thousands of scientists that are colluding to say, well, as soon as we admit that there's no problem, they're going to cut our funding, so we have to perpetuate this myth and this hoax. I don't believe any of that. It just doesn't strike me as credible that you've got these timid academicians who are, I mean, if you wanted to tell me that Hollywood directors, or, I mean, I just made that up, but I mean, I can think of any demographic that's far more likely to want to conspire to commit a hoax than college professors. So, anyway.
Okay. So in terms of what it would take to move, whether we say the world or at least North America, in the direction of utilizing more renewable energy, what do you think it would take?
Well, that's an excellent question. And by the way, that's exactly the type of thing that we get at in the book, when you think about it. So they're political issues, and those are driven by people. And the people are driven by, the people are essentially manipulated by the corporate-owned media that is trying to get them to believe a certain thing. Okay, so, but it's going to be hard to cover up something like a huge change in the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere over a very short period of time. More people are going to say, I've had it with this thing, I want change, I insist upon change right now. So it could happen at a kind of grassroots political level, though I'm not sure that's what's going to happen. What I do think is going to happen is that the cost, because I think that there's enough money, there's enough big money and power to keep us pumping gas and burning coal for a heck of a long time. So I don't think that's going to happen. because I do think that people will be continually manipulated until they just simply can't do this anymore. But what will happen is that the cost of all of this stuff is coming down. In other words, the cost of solar energy, wind energy, geothermal, biomass, hydrokinetics, the ways of extracting energy and harnessing and using it for the purpose of that we all know and love, transportation, heating our buildings, and so forth. The cost of all these things is falling. The efficiencies are rising. We'll soon be to the point where nobody will be able to say, oh, I want to put up another coal-fired power plant even though I could get the same amount of energy out of wind cheaper. Okay, so the moment it becomes equally, the moment the cost differential goes away, we're going to have this thing whether the coal people or the oil people want it or not.
Okay. I've also heard that there's a perspective that as inhabitants of this planet, we've actually passed the point of no return, and that although the idea of moving towards renewable energy is necessary or noble, or however you want to look at it, it's almost moot, at least from certain viewpoints.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an extreme point of view or if there's a broad consensus on that, but can you comment
Sure.
on really where we are in terms of correcting the sins of our past?
Sure. Here's what I believe. Bill McKibben, who's probably the most, the biggest household name associated with environmentalism, whose recent book, Earth, Eaarth, the title of Earth, spelled that way, is a suggestion that we positively do not have the planet that we had 100 years ago, and we can never go back there. He points out that there is no natural environment, that there are PCBs in the Arctic, that our bloodstreams have 140 to 150 different synthetic chemicals in them, and there's nothing that we can do to return to a fully natural environment. Having said that, and that sounds pretty, pessimistic, doesn't it? And there is a certain amount of gloom associated with reading that book. I think, is renewable really doable is good. But I'll tell you what, McKibben, he's pretty well published and writes a heck of a good book. And his viewpoint on this thing is that the time during which we can freely consume energy is over, okay, or will soon be over. Okay. He points out, for instance, actually one of the people I interviewed in my book, Nate Hagans, who's a kind of a follower of McKibben, says, look, we consume, the average adult American consumes 2,500 calories a day endosomatically, in other words, into the body. We consume 230,000 calories a day with all the other stuff we have, all the cars we drive, the lights we have, all of this stuff associated with our lifestyle, which is ever increasing in terms of how much energy we can pull out of the ground and consume. So he goes, that's what is fundamentally unsustainable. He goes, but is that really the end of the world? Suppose we have to get used to living somewhat like we did, half a century ago. Nate Hagans is about my age, and he goes, we grew up in the 60s, and we had a nice lifestyle at that point. And I go, you're absolutely right. So in other words, to a degree, the fact that we will soon, of course, Americans are only one little slice of this pie. There are 300 million Americans, but think of all the populations in India, in China, Indonesia, the people who are becoming urbanized for the first time, and say, I want to live like those Americans. I want all the good fancy stuff and the blinking lights and the big cars and so forth and so on. Well, guess what? That's not going to work. I mean, that's McKibben's point, and I suppose it's mine too. In other words, we do need to kind of change our focus of who we are and how we conduct ourselves with respect to this planet. And I think that's one of the wonderful challenges associated with being alive at this time on Earth, is that we have to say, I wrote a thing the other day that says, the new living large is living small. So in other words, I think there's a reasonable chance that at a certain point we're going to say, you know what, I simply don't, it's more fun not to ruin the planet. It's more fun to live within the means of sustainability and understand that we have a responsibility to 7 billion people around here on this planet now and to the generations that are going to come in the future. The Native Americans they didn't make a single decision associated with where they would live, how they would live, that didn't contemplate a minimum of 5 generations down the line. When was the last time, You know, when was the last time somebody in Washington, D.C. said, you know what, I'm going to make a decision that is because it's the right thing for 5 generations down the line. Trust me, they don't think five months down the line. They don't look beyond the next election cycle. So things are going to be changing.
Now, speaking of Washington, let's bring this around to concerns about national security and our dependence on foreign oil. I would think that Washington would be interested in that, but it seems like they have a history of supporting the oil industry. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, there are a couple of different things. First of all, the military is fantastically interested in renewable energy. The U.S. Army, as an example, is all over the idea. They have a thing that I saw their PowerPoint on this thing in which they talk about every soldier as a power manager. That's something, and they're investing heavily in this, largely because protecting the supply line of oil in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth is a lethally dangerous thing to do. More soldiers die protecting that supply line than any other single activity. So that's one thing. But I think what you mean by Washington is the fact that our congressmen are essentially bought. I hate to say it, but the level of corruption associated with the individual decision-making in Washington, D.C. is almost all about simply how much campaign contribution comes from which individual sources. Congress recently had to vote on maintaining the subsidies for the oil industry. Now, these are subsidies that have been in place 90 years that provide billions and billions of extra profit to the most profitable industry on the planet. Do you know that the people who voted for withdrawing those subsidies received 1/5 per capita the number of campaign contributions than the people who voted for maintaining those subsidies? So the level of corruption is obvious, it's overt. So when you're looking at why is this thing not happening from Washington, you don't have to look any further than that.
Wow.
And moreover, you have the military-industrial complex. When Eisenhower left office at the end of his term in 1960, he said, watch out for this. You know, I'm a military guy, I know how to handle an army, but the next guy may not. And the last thing you want is he was the person who coined the term the military-industrial complex. So now you've got these multi-trillion-dollar organizations they're looking for something to do. And guess what? Maintaining our access to foreign oil makes as much sense as anything else.
Wow. Well, this is a fascinating and complex subject, and I know we've only touched on the surface. So if our viewers would like to find out more, how could they do so?
I think the thing to do is to come to the website 2Green, you mentioned it at the start of the show, 2Green Energy, that's the number 2greenenergy.com. Has an enormous amount of material on it. You can certainly get a copy of the book through it. It's actually on Amazon.com, but you'll be able to find the link from there.
Great. Any summating messages before we go?
I like to believe that I hope my enthusiasm on this thing has somehow come across this table. I believe that this is the most exciting topic on Earth. This is something that the health and safety of everybody living on this planet is at stake. There are solutions, they're available, they're becoming more obvious, more people are kind of figuring this out. This is a great time to be alive. I hope readers get into this stuff, learn about it. I think everybody should be able to have a relevant, informed discussion on this topic. It's huge.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You bet, George.
This is George Alger signing off for another segment of Our Ventura. Until we see you again, thanks for watching.